Good evening and welcome to Buck Run Baptist Church. We're taking a look at the book of Genesis. We've been studying this year, and we're grateful for the technology that enables us, even when we cannot gather on Wednesday nights for our midweek service, that we can still continue. I'm able to teach, so thanks for watching tonight. We left off last week with the end of Genesis chapter 45. And we've been looking at the Joseph narrative. The Joseph narrative begins in chapter 37. And now we've come to the place where Joseph has revealed himself to his brothers. They realize that the one whom they sold into slavery is now their Lord. He is over them. He is the only way they can survive. And so now that he's revealed himself to them, he tells them to go and get their father. At the end of chapter 45, I want to back up and look beginning in verse 25 and following again, because it talks about them revealing to Jacob that his son Joseph is alive. It says, "So they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob, and they told him, 'Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt.'" Now that would be a lot for anybody to process. For about 20 years, he has believed, I think 21 years at this point, he has believed that Joseph is dead. Now he finds not only is he alive, he is master of Egypt. And it says in the ESV, his heart became numb. But literally in Hebrew, it says his heart stopped. It paused. It's a unique description, but it's like it really did skip a beat. Now remember that Jacob has been sort of threatening to die for a long time. When he thought Joseph was dead, he talked about dying then. When they wanted to take Benjamin back down into Egypt, he talked about dying then. Remember what Judah pleads to Joseph before he knows Joseph is his brother. "Oh, that this will kill our father." And some of you are old enough to remember Sanford and Son, and he always used to do that. "Oh, I'm coming to meet you, Elizabeth," and sort of fake a heart attack. Well, Jacob has been doing that a long time, but now this time it looks like it almost happens. His heart stops. It sort of skips a beat because this is so much for him to take in. He did not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him. Now, these wagons would have been Egyptian wagons, not like anything in Canaan. So Jacob sees the evidence. This has to be true. He sees these, I'm guessing, rather ornate and very finely made Egyptian wagons, the kind of wagons that royalty would have access to. He hears the story from his sons, so he believes it. And it says the spirit of their father Jacob revived. So he has this momentary pause of his heart, but now taking in all the news and realizing that his son is alive, he says, "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." There are certain parallels here between the story of Jacob and the story of the prodigal son. Here's one of those things that sort of echoes in Luke 15, where the father says, not "my son came back to me," but he says, "This my son was dead and is alive." And Jacob uses that language here because his son Joseph, as far as he was concerned, was gone, was dead, and now he lives. And so he says, "I'll go see him," here it is again, "before I die." And so Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba. Now, again, here's one of those phrases I think that we miss if we're not really paying close attention. Literally, this could be rendered in Hebrew that he went on his journey. He sort of continued on his journey to Egypt. Now, we've seen Jacob is on nothing but a journey, right? God has promised him the land of Canaan, but he's been a nomad. He's been moving around. He began there in Canaan, but then he went over to Padan Aram and to the region where his family was from and worked for his uncle Laban. He came back. He's wandered around. Hebron. Now he's going down to Egypt. And so what the writer here, Moses, is showing us is that Jacob is on a journey. It's a continuous journey. And in a sense, it doesn't even end at his death. And let's keep this in mind, because even through the end of the book of Genesis, we're going to see this. Remember, it sort of has become Joseph's story, but now beginning with chapter 46, it's really more about Jacob again. It's Jacob's story because it's the story of Israel. Joseph is significant for a lot of reasons, but primarily only because he advances the story of Israel. It's because of Joseph that Israel's going to get down into Egypt. But this is Jacob's journey. Jacob, remember, what's his other name that God gave him? Israel. So this is part of Israel's journey. Hold your finger here, but if you turn over to Hebrews chapter 11, remember that great hall of fame, by faith, by faith, by faith, beginning with Abel and Enoch, going on down through many other biblical heroes. When we get to the part about Jacob, and it talks about Jacob, down in verse 13, it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth." In other words, Jacob doesn't ever really get the promised land in this life, but he does see it from afar. So he's constantly on a journey. His ultimate destination is the land of promise, but he's not going to get it yet. Here he is leaving Canaan, going down into Egypt. He's continuing on his journey. It's actually taking him away from the land of promise. So does God not keep his promise to Jacob? Well, let's read on. Israel, back in chapter 46 of Genesis. So Israel went on his journey, continued on his journey with all that he had, and he came to Beersheba. Now, Beersheba is the southernmost point, of the land of Canaan. And then you cross into the Sinai and then on into Egypt. So he came to Beersheba. He stops there at the edge of Canaan. He's leaving the land of promise, the land God has promised to Abraham. And he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." You see this a lot when God speaks. He speaks in a doublet like this. Samuel, Samuel. Here you see Jacob, Jacob. And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt." In other words, don't be afraid to leave Canaan. "For there in Egypt I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt. I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes." Excuse me. Now, that's a fascinating prophecy. Let's just look at that. Think through that for a moment. So he says, "I'm going to take you down into Egypt." That's me doing that. You're not doing this by accident. This isn't plan B. God has no plan B. And there in Egypt, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to go down with you to Egypt. You're leaving the land of promise, but you're not going alone. You're not leaving me, because I'm going with you. I will also bring you up again. Now, what does this mean? Well, it could mean several things. Certainly, you could read it that God's going to bring him back to the land of Canaan. But if you've read the rest of the book, we know that that does not happen before his death. It does happen that he's brought back up and buried in in Canaan. And God can mean that, and certainly that's true. I'm going to bring your body back to the land of promise. It can also mean exactly what we read in Hebrews 11, that God's going to fulfill that promise ultimately in the Messiah. He's going to give him that land, but he's going to give it to him in Jesus. And that's what Hebrews chapter 11, at the end of that chapter, in verse 39, all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. What the writer is saying there is that apart from us, what happens in our generation, in the first generation Christians, which of course is the coming of the Messiah, the coming of the Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection, that is the thing in which they ultimately receive their promises. So how does Jacob receive the land of promise? Well, in Jesus, because it is his. He's the son of David. He's the king of Israel. And the land is his. The whole earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So Jacob receives his promise, but he does it in Christ. And that's what one thing that God means. I will also bring you up again. I'm going to bring you up again to the land of promise in the Messiah. It can also refer to, I think, ultimately the resurrection. All of those things are true. And since God is speaking here, God knows all of those things, and he can certainly mean all of them. Even if Moses does not fully understand all of that when he writes this, we know through the New Testament that God is going to bring Christ, the Messiah, into the land and give him the land. We know that Jacob's going to be buried in the land. We know that ultimately God's going to resurrect Jacob, and he's going to give him the land in a new heaven and a new earth. There's so many ways that God fulfills this promise. He dies in faith, not having received the thing promised, but having seen it afar off. And the writer to the Hebrews says, because it was impossible for him to receive it in his day, because it had to be fulfilled in our day through Jesus Christ. So God says, I'm going to go down with you to Egypt. I'll bring you again. And then he says this, Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. In other words, you're going to not just be reunited with your son, you're going to die an old man. In Joseph's presence, your son Joseph, whom you love, is going to close your eyes. What a tender and beautiful expression of the love between the son and the father, that Joseph is going to be there with him as he dies. Joseph will perform that very tender expression of love as he closes his father's eyes in death. So Jacob here has a great promise from God. God reminds him of the promise of the land that's going to be his. So he says, don't worry, you're going to get that promise, not in this life, but you go on down to Egypt. That is me leading you there. I'm going to go with you, and you're going to die in peace with your son Joseph. So verse 5, then Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. So here they go down in these Egyptian wagons, and they're going from Beersheba. They're going to go through the Sinai, and they're going to go into Egypt. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt. So you know how God had blessed Jacob with his uncle's livestock, and he got a part of that for tending them. And then when he came back into the promised land in Canaan, his flocks and herds continued to grow. His sons cared for them. And so this is a massive tribe. In fact, we're told exactly how many there are as we read on. They took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt. Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons' sons with him, his daughters, and his sons' daughters. All his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. Now, these are the names of the descendants of Israel. And I'm not going to take the time to read all these names, largely because there are some I can't pronounce. But it mentions the 12 sons and who their mother was, the two wives, Rachel and Leah, the two concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah, and which sons they had. And then it mentions the names of their sons. So here, Jacob's sons and his grandsons are mentioned, and it enumerates them. And it goes, look down at verse 19, the last mention here, the sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife, Joseph and Benjamin. So, of course, Rachel was the love of his life. These two sons, his favorite sons, especially Joseph. And to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, bore to him. And the sons of Benjamin, and it mentions them, he had 14 persons in all. The sons of Dan, now look at verse 26. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. So Jacob's actual descendants, 66 persons in all. The sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. And all the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. So I think this, if you add these up, you get 69. And then Dinah, the daughter, would make 70. So he has 70 descendants in his clan, not including the in-laws. And of course, this number is significant throughout the scriptures, and particularly in the book of Genesis. This is, of course, 10 times 7, the number of completion, that perfect number. And it's showing God's blessing upon Jacob. Jacob has been the recipient of God's promises, and God has kept those promises and blessed him. But it's not all been easy. We're going to see that as when he talks to Pharaoh. He had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. So in Egypt is divided up into different regions. And the land of Goshen is considered, it's also called Ramses. It's considered the most fertile part of Egypt. And he goes to the land of Goshen. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father in Goshen. Now, if you think about this, here is a sort of a head of state, Joseph. He is like the prime minister, and he gets in his royal chariot. And no doubt he's accompanied by many servants and other officials. It's an official sort of a parade. He goes out to meet his father in the land of Goshen. And Joseph, he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. That's interesting, a little detail. If you look and see the place where Joseph falls on Benjamin's neck and weeps, it says, and Benjamin wept also. Here, it just says Joseph wept. So sort of the writer is showing us that here's Jacob, who was so overwhelmed when he got the news that Joseph was alive, and yet now upon seeing him, he's like a statue. Joseph falls on him and is weeping, but Jacob is sort of impassive. He's sort of like a stone. He does not weep in return. No doubt he's moved, but he's apparently dry-eyed. But finally he speaks, verse 30, Israel, using the name that God gave him, Israel said to Joseph, now let me die. There he goes again. Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you're still alive. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and I will tell Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they've been keepers of livestock, and they've brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. Now when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So Joseph here, a lot of times people are a little bit embarrassed of their family, and they sort of, now don't tell them you chew tobacco or whatever. Don't let that out. Here he says, don't say you're a shepherd, say you're keepers of livestock. Now the Egyptians were very sedentary. We know this from their own history, and they did consider themselves somewhat superior to the shepherds that were in the north part of the country. And so possibly Joseph knows this, and he's alluding to this. But he tells them, don't call yourself a shepherd, like the only thing you do is tend sheep. Call yourself livestock men. And that's literally what it says in Hebrew, men of livestock. Let's see how well they follow his instructions. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, my father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Goshen. They're now in the land of Goshen. And from among his brothers, he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Interesting. He has 10 brothers, 10 half-brothers. He chooses half of them to present, sort of representative to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, what's your occupation? Here's the question Joseph knows he'll ask. And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were. I don't know if they're just so sort of awestruck, they forget, or they just say, we're not going to try and fool him. I don't know what their motive is, but I know they don't do what Joseph tells them. They say, we're shepherds. But I think Joseph had worried for nothing because Pharaoh does not react negatively. They said to Pharaoh, we've come to sojourn in the land, for there's no pasture in your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Now, this is sort of following Middle Eastern custom. Pharaoh has already said beforehand that to Joseph, bring them down here and I'll let them have the best of the land. I'll let them have Goshen. But they're not going to be presumptuous. They're not going to just say, hey, we've come to get what you promised us. They go through this polite ritual of asking permission. They know how it's going to turn out, but they ask, would you please let us dwell in the land of Goshen? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, now remember, Pharaoh does not speak Hebrew, he speaks Egyptian. So he said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. So Pharaoh says, let them live in the land of Goshen and let them take care of my livestock. Whichever ones are best at doing this, let the able men do it. So you have Pharaoh sort of relieving Joseph's anxiety. He's not put off by the fact that they're just shepherds, and he knows that they'll take care of his livestock, and he gives them the best of the land. So Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Important detail. First of all, you would expect Joseph to sort of come in, sort of the humble servant bowing to Pharaoh, but because Pharaoh, he's Pharaoh. He's the king of the land. He's at this point, the only one in that part of the whole world who has anything. The rest of them are going through this incredible drought and famine of multiple years, and yet it's made Pharaoh rich. But Jacob does not come in scraping and bowing before him. He comes in like the patriarch that he is, and he blesses Pharaoh. I think it's the author's way of showing us that even though Pharaoh has all the political power, Jacob represents the spiritual power. And though Pharaoh is blessing him physically, Jacob can bless him spiritually. Jacob is speaking for God. And there's power in this blessing. And it's showing us, in a sense, who really is supreme in the relationship. Not in the power structures of this world, but in the power structures of heaven, because Jacob is the son of promise. And he acts in grace and mercy by blessing Pharaoh. And so Jacob said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh said to Jacob in verse 8, how many are the days of the years of your life? And so Jacob responds to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers, in the days of their sojourning. Now that's an interesting statement. First of all, you think 130 years, and yet he says, my days are few. Life really is short, isn't it? Even if you live to be 130 years old, which I presume no one watching this will. But he's 130 years old, and he calls his days few because they have flown by. Life really is just a vapor. It vanishes. It's like the grass that withers in a day. And Jacob knows that. At the end of life, there seems to be a quickening of time. It really does fly by. And he says, my days have been few. The second thing he says, my days have been evil. Now that's not a word of moral judgment. He's not saying that he's been horribly evil or only evil has happened to him in a moral sense. This is a word for like tragedy, calamity. He says, my days have been full of trouble. I've had so much evil, so much heartache in my life. Now, this is a fascinating statement because in one sense, Jacob has gotten everything he ever wanted. What did he want? Well, remember, we're told, I think it's in chapter 25, when he is in the womb, how there is a striving, a wrestling between him and Esau. And from the very beginning, he wants the birthright. And there's this striving between him and Esau. He gets the birthright. He wants the blessing. He gets the blessing. He wants Rachel. He gets Rachel. He wants a lot of sheep. He gets a lot of sheep. He wants Canaan. He wants food. All of these things that he wants and he asks for. He wants lots of sons. Everything he wants, he gets. But at what cost? So he wants the blessing. He wants the birthright. He gets it. He gets the birthright. But at what cost? There's a breach in the relationship between him and Esau, and he has to go into a far and foreign land. So he gets it, but man, it cost him his relationship with his brother. He wants Rachel, and he gets her, but it cost him also getting Leah and those two handmaids. He wants lots of sons. He gets them, but boy, there's a lot of trouble. There's a lot of striving between them. There's even mass murder that they commit. There's strife between them that causes them to feign the death of one of them and to sell him into slavery. He gets those sons, but at what great cost? He wants food down in Egypt, but it cost him something, sending his sons, allowing Benjamin to go. So even though he gets all these incredible blessings, they really come with a great amount of trouble and heartache. And he is looking back over his life. He says, my days, 130 years, have been few and evil. And they've not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. He's not here just talking about the length of Abraham's and Isaac's life. He's talking about the quality. And he knows that in many ways he's not lived up to what they did, and certainly not to the faith of Abraham. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. So now a second blessing. He blesses them as he comes. He blesses him as he leaves. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, again a synonym for Goshen, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. You know, there's a parallel here also going on. Remember, when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he says, you meant it for evil. God meant it for good. And in the same way, we have God here is moving Jacob down into the land of Egypt. And he says, I'm going to make you a great nation there. Well, what's going to happen? Slavery. Israel is going to become a nation of slaves. They're going to be in bondage. But what's God doing? Egypt will ultimately mean it for evil. God is using it for good. God is leading them down to the place where they're going to be enslaved. Why? So he can deliver them. This is a great mystery to us. Sometimes we ask why God allows trouble in our lives, why God allows sorrow. Ultimately, it's so he can deliver us. Because when our faith is in Christ, we realize that we don't judge God's blessing on our lives based on what happens to us here, but on what happens to us in eternity. Like Jacob, we might die in faith, not having received things promised, but having seen them afar off. God hasn't promised that our lives will be full of sorrow, free of sorrow, but he's promised that one day they will be. He's not promised that we'll be free from pain, but one day we will be. You see here God casting really a vision for us through Jacob. The story of Jacob is the story of Israel, and the story of Israel is ultimately the story of Jesus. Jesus is the true Israelite. And how does God deliver him? It's through suffering, not around it, but through it. Through his suffering, he brings many sons to glory. For the joy set before him, he endures the suffering. And this is what we see here in the story of Egypt. Now, the scene shifts back, if you would, to Joseph and his administration of Egypt as the prime minister. And we're going to see here the way that he blesses Egypt. Now, this is God showing us that really the riches of Egypt are attributed and attributable to Jacob, to Joseph rather, but in a sense to Israel. And this is God showing how he blesses Egypt, not for Egypt's sake, but for Israel's sake. And here Joseph is the one who gets great wealth for the king. There was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So Joseph, remember the first 7 years, the years of plenty, he had told people to bring 1/5, 20% of their crop, and they had to give it to Pharaoh. And they were producing so much that was fine with them. Joseph set that apart. Now during the years of famine, they can't produce much. They have to come and they have to buy grain. And so they are happy to spend their currency to get the grain, but of course this enriches Pharaoh. Joseph brings it and shows it to Pharaoh. When all the money was spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. So ultimately they run out of money. They say, we're out of money, but we're hungry. Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone. Now this might have some parallels to what we're going through right now. We're in trouble. We send to the government, you got to do something. You got to help us. We're in trouble. We've lost our jobs. We're having to stay home. We can't work. You've got to help. And this is exactly what's going on in Egypt. And Joseph answered, okay, give your livestock, and I'll give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money's gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when the year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, we'll not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of the livestock are my lord's. There's nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, so that the land may not be desolate. So they come and they say, okay, we're out of money, we're out of livestock, all that's left is us and our land. So they sell themselves as indentured servants to Pharaoh along with their land. So I want you to see now, Pharaoh he has all the money, he has all the land, he has all the livestock, and he has the people as his servants. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priest he did not buy, for the priest had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. A couple of things here to point out. One is, we read this, and our democratic tendencies make us read this and go, wow, this is terrible. I will just point out that in the ancient world, this would have looked, no one would read that and go, well, this is terrible. People would read this and they would say, wow, what a smart guy Joseph is. Because this is what kings do. They rule their people, and they own, the crown owns a lot of the land, and then the crown is able to give big swaths of land to people. And in the history of England, for instance, this is how you become a duke or a lord. I mean, whoever the king or the queen is would give a certain castle and land to someone and a title, and they're the lord of that land. And then all the peasants work for them, pay them taxes, raise crops for them, and they in turn pay taxes to the crown. That's the way it works. So Joseph is doing this on behalf of Pharaoh. He's getting all the land, he's enslaving all the people, and he's ruling on behalf of Pharaoh. He's building the wealth of Egypt, and that's really the point that the author is making, Moses is making, because he wants us to see that it is the Hebrews who really provide for the wealth of Egypt, but then that wealth is going to turn against them. They make Egypt strong, which Egypt is then going to attempt to extinguish them when there's another Pharaoh. And that's sort of the point that he wants us to see. And the other thing I want to point out to you is this little reference to the fact, why is this here that the priest, he didn't buy the priest's land. They were given an allowance. Well, because when Israel gets to the promised land, God's not going to let his priest own land. He's going to divide up all the land between the 12 tribes, but there is no parcel of land given to the Levites. There's no tribe of Levi in Israel. Joseph, remember, is going to get 2 portions, Ephraim and Manasseh. But the Levites, the priests, get nothing. You know what they get? God will say to them, you get me. You don't get any land. They're allowed to live in the cities of refuge, but they don't get land. What they get is God. And there's a contrast here that Moses is setting up already. The priests of Egypt, they get land. Why? Because that's what they want. They want the things of this world. God's priests, they get him. And there's a great contrast here. So Joseph said to the people in verse 23, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here's seed for you. You shall sow the land, and at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones. Now look, Joseph is a benevolent dictator. He gets their land, through Pharaoh. He owns it all. But he says, okay, I'm going to be gracious to you. The land belongs to Pharaoh, but I'm going to let you live on it and till it, and you're going to keep 80% of the crops. Now, how gracious is that? He owns it. He could demand 100% of it, but he says, no, you keep 80%, but you got to give 20% to Pharaoh. And look at their response. They're elated. They're delighted. You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord. We will be servants to Pharaoh. Joseph is smart. He puts them in a position where anything he does looks gracious. If he lets them live, it looks gracious. And he does more than let them live. He basically lets them have the same thing they had in the years of plenty, 80%. You work the land, you keep 80%, you always give 20%. But see, and during the years of plenty, it was just they had to do that for 7 years. Now they have to do it from now on. And by the way, we know from Egyptian records that this is exactly the case, that the Egyptians were required to give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and the Bible says that this is where it originated. So they said, "You've saved our lives, may it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." Verse 26, so Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the 5th. The land of the priest did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. Now, the implication here is that Israel is exempted from what the Egyptians have to do, because Pharaoh gives them the land of Goshen. They don't have to give it back. It was already a benevolence from Pharaoh, a royal bequest, if you will. And so they live in the land of Goshen, and God blesses them, and they have an abundance of livestock, an abundance of crops, and they are fruitful and multiply greatly. Verse 28, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So he lives to be 147. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me." So this was an ancient way to take an oath, to put your hand under the thigh of the one that you were making a covenant with. And this is what he says: "If I have found favor in your sight," in other words, do me a favor. Do this for me. Promise to me to deal kindly and truly with me. And what is the great request that Jacob makes of his son Joseph? "Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." Where's that? That's in Hebron, right? He answered, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So this is not his death yet. We're going to look at that next week. But here, before he blesses his sons, the one request he has: don't let me be buried in Egypt. Now, I'm not going to develop a full theology of this, but I just want to point out to you that in the Bible, the care of the dead body is important. It's significant. When Saul and Jonathan are killed and their bodies are hung on the wall at Bethshan, what happens? The men of Gilboa, they ride through the night to take those bodies down. Why? Because to expose a body like that is to curse them. What does the law say? "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." When Joshua and his men kill the king of Ai, what do? They hang his body on a tree. But because they're Israelites, they only do it during the day. At night, at evening, they bury him. They don't expose him. When David allows the Gibeonites to have vengeance for what Saul did to them, and they kill the sons of Saul, remember Rizpah, the mother of 2 of those sons, she puts a vigil over their bodies. Their exposed bodies are left out by the Gibeonites. And what do? She beats away the wild beast and the buzzards for months until the rains come, and David allows them to be buried. The point is that there's a care of the body that you see in the Bible, that there's a respect shown it. And to Jacob, it matters where he's buried. Don't let me be buried in Egypt. This is not my home. In death, he knows he's going to receive the promise that God has given him. Take me back there. And indeed, this is a promise that Joseph keeps. But before he dies, before he's buried, he's going to bless his sons. And that's what we're going to see next week when we look at chapter 48. I want to say thanks for tuning in. I pray that God will bless the study of the Word, and even that this specific passage will be an encouragement and a blessing to you in these challenging times. May God use it, and may he be honored in your life. Thanks for watching. God bless.